So why am I talking about tooling? So Chrome DevTools, we consider Chrome DevTools a product, but nevertheless, there is a lot of overlap between DevTools and, of course, the web platform. We consider DevTools to be the window to web developers. It connects whatever we put on the web platform to the developers. We help them understand and debug new features. And ultimately, we want to drive feature adoption as sort of the mission of our product. For those who are not familiar with DevTools, we have a huge breadth of features. So, for example, you can use the Elements panel to look at the document structure and layout. You can use the Sources panel for JavaScript debugging. You can use the Network panel for inspecting network traffic. You can use the Application panel to look at the application state. Performance panel to look at the performance profile. Issues panel to look at warnings that we have recently added. Currently, these are mostly related to trust and safety related issues. And then, of course, there's also JavaScript console, emulation features, and there's a ton of things I haven't even showed yet. But last but not least, there's also Lighthouse Audits, a way that we have provided to help developers sort of find out whether their pages are fast and usable for their users. Now, obviously, our goal is to help web developers adopt web platforms' best features and best practices. And ideally, we can offer tooling support for every new web platform feature that is launched, so that developers receive adequate tooling support when they want to adopt and understand these new features. And indeed, the Blink launch process actually has debugability as part of it. So somewhere deep hidden inside the document on the launch process says that please describe the desired DevTools debugging support for your feature and contact the Chrome DevTools team if you want to make this happen. But then again, at the end, it also relativates a little bit and says, if your feature doesn't require changes to DevTools in order to provide a good debugging experience, feel free to delete the section. And I have the suspicion that many people actually do that. So in practice, we have way too many new features coming out every year. If you just look at things that have been added or have been proposed since milestone 81, we have 171 features that have been added to the web platform. And tooling is often not the first thing that people think about when they design and implement their features. And also implementing these features usually require a mix of between domain-specific knowledge and design and front-end skills, which is, I think, to some degree rare on the Chrome team or for people who work on Chrome, because those are two, well, different things on the spectrum of programming skills. So that's why we usually set up collaborations between DevTools team and feature teams to ensure that we can create or offer great tooling support. This way we share the responsibilities and can explore solutions that are not following existing patterns. When I say existing patterns, usually I mean very simple things like just outputting warnings onto the DevTools console, which is not a great solution. And there's often better ways to do it. And through these collaborations, we learn from each other. DevTools team learns about feature-specific implementations, and teams that collaborate with us also learn about how DevTools works and how features are implemented in DevTools frontend. So maybe a brief introduction to the architecture of DevTools. DevTools frontend is a web application. It's written in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, although increasingly also in TypeScript. It connects through Chrome DevTools protocol to Blink or V8 or Chromium, depending on which is the relevant part for tooling. Inside of those components, there is a piece that implements the DevTools backend, which we usually call the inspector agent. And through the DevTools protocol, the debugging capabilities exposed by Chromium, Blink, or V8 is made available to the front end. So as you can see, to make a great tooling support, you have to know both the backend and the front end. You have to know how to write things in C++, but also how to use web technologies to express whatever UI you want to actually implement. So in the past year, we have seen a wide spectrum of different shapes of engagement. Sometimes the tooling support implementation is driven by the DevTools team. Sometimes it's driven by the feature teams themselves. There are different pros and cons and trade-offs for the decision here. Usually it's based on resource constraints. If it's driven by the DevTools team, we can make sure that we get a great integrated UX for the feature. But often enough, that involves additional communication overhead because we have to keep track of where the project for the feature itself is moving, whether there are delays, whether there are changes to plans. And since we are not familiar with the feature initially, we have to invest quite a bit of time, and that doesn't scale. If it's driven by the feature team, usually synchronizing with launch is not too big of a deal because the feature teams have it in their hands to drive both the feature launch and tooling launch. But they are often unfamiliar with DevTools, and so it's often time-consuming for them. So in the past year, we had quite a couple of examples that were, I think, success stories for these sort of collaborations. We recently, or a couple of months ago, introduced the media panel into DevTools to inspect media feedback. We introduced X-client data header decoding to be able to decode the protobuf that is being sent as a proprietary X-client data header. We, together with the storage team, implemented storage quota in DevTools in the application panel so that you can set a custom storage quota. Web authentication panel is something that we also fairly recently added to DevTools to emulate authentication devices without actually requiring a physical device. Some other things like trust token support or general web assembly debugging support are also coming along very nicely. This is just a small sample of things that we've been working on together with other feature teams. So usually, the way to set up these collaboration is to have the feature teams either reach out directly to us, or if we notice that there's tooling support required for some things that we think is going to be important, we do the initial outreach as well. I usually try to set up a face-to-face meeting or a virtual face-to-face meeting so that people get acquainted with each other. We define points of contact on both teams, define some user stories around how tooling should work, how developers should, what kind of debugging workflow developers should have. We then, discuss design and user experience, do the implementation and code review cycles, and then in the end, launch, maintain, document things. When I say documentation, this also means, documenting it to the public through posts on web fundamentals. We also have an engineering blog for DevTools to describe or to essentially tell people how we implement things, and in the end, of course, celebrate successes and share credits. So we have a couple of open questions, of course. One of which is, how would we scale better? Even though we have had a bunch of collaborations, I think it's in the range of like 15, 16 collaborations that we set up successfully this year. It's by far not the 171 collaborations that we could have had for all the web platform features. Obviously, not all of them require tooling support, but nevertheless, I think we are falling short. Second question would be, how do we create awareness around tooling? Last BlinkOn in Sunnyvale, I talked about this topic again as well. And back then, the biggest takeaway was that we should talk about successes, tell success stories, make people, aware that there is something to be gained by collaborating. But then there's also the question, how to prioritize? And is there a point where we say no? So at this point, we have 15 minutes left for discussions, questions, comments, suggestions.
With this kind of scaled design process, it feels like there's a risk of building a product where we just kind of add support for more and more features, and that's exposed to developers as more and more buttons and more menus and more complexity. Do you have any thoughts on how we rein in the complexity of the tool while still continuing to support all of these new features?
So I think there's two aspects to it. First of all, DevTools at this point is not a great example for discoverability, I would say. We already have the problem where we have a bunch of features where people just don't know that they exist or cannot find them. And it is a challenge. And I guess it is sort of a trade-off between adding more features and at the same time make them accessible enough so that people still know about them. That said, I often see that many of the tooling support we add follow certain patterns that we could use the same sort of UX language for. So often enough, it's about surfacing warnings. Previously, we just all dumped them onto the DevTools console, which made it cluttered. And now we have the issues panel, which helps sort of collect and sort these issues and also reference to, the right resources for further debugging. There's also the class of emulation features where you want to emulate something like some web API, like locale or time zones or some media query or these sort of things. And at this point, we don't really have one unified place to put those. But we're definitely thinking about sort of collecting these all sorts of emulations that would belong together, put it into one place, make it searchable, so that if the developer is thinking about emulating something that they would require a physical device for, they would know where to go. So yeah, I'm really happy that we have a UX designer to help us with this sort of questions, but it is not straightforward indeed.
How should feature teams think about determining how high priority tooling is for their feature, whether their feature really needs tooling in DevTools or whether their feature can get by with the existing console debugging type tooling? How can I know whether I should be investing my team's time in improving the tooling for my feature versus fixing bugs in the feature, developing new sub features?
Yeah. I think ultimately it's a little bit of a mix between a gut feeling and also just reaching out to us in the first place so that we can talk about it. I think it doesn't hurt if you just reach out to the DevTools team and we just talk it over. If it turns out that we don't need to do anything, even better. But usually there are some things that we could do. And often it also depends on what your target audience for this feature is. If you're just targeting it to partners that should know about these features, where you have a direct sort of connection to these partners, then usually it's probably okay to not start with tooling support. But if it's like design features that you would like to have a lot of people use, then I think it does make sense to think about tooling support very early on.
Do we have like a lot of, I realize it varies from feature to feature, but do we have data about how much Chrome DevTools support impacts the adoption of features that we launch?
At this point, we don't really have a good way to measure this. At this point, my team is looking into some options for in-product surveys to collect data on this sort of thing. But in general, we don't really have like a unified way to measure how tooling impacts adoption, besides, having the usual avenues on Twitter, having sort of metrics on documentation that we put on Web Fundamentals. Nowadays, the avenue of going to conferences and talking to people is unfortunately a little bit limited. But in general, we do also get the feeling like if we don't add tooling support for some features, developers will sooner or later come at us and complain that there is something missing. For example, CSS grid tooling support has been missing for quite a while, and we have gotten very clear feedback from tons of different surveys, and also talking to developers directly, that this is something that they need. So like if the feature doesn't start out with tooling support, we will know about it soon enough.
What's the best way to reach the team?
So one way to reach the team, I think that would be the best way, is to just write to devtools-dev@chromium.org. That's generally the mailing list that everybody on the team is reading, and I'm on there as well. So if you just use that mailing list, somebody should be able to respond, including collaborators and Microsoft, who are contributing to Chrome DevTools quite a bit as well. Yeah. Any more comments about anything that we want to talk about?
Are there cases where you need more support from feature teams than you're getting? Do you ever reach out to feature teams and say, like, hey, we want to do more in this space, but we don't have the context?
So often enough, it's like every team has resource constraints, right? Like, I don't think we have any team that's running out of things to do. And so often enough, us approaching feature teams about tooling support is a little bit hard, because they're like, no, tooling is not on the top priority for us right now. And so often enough, it works best if the feature team reaches out to us, because then we know for sure that they put a lot of value in sort of pursuing this, and that's why we can drive it to success. Sometimes for things like WebAssembly, or for things like trust and safety, we know that there is like a higher level initiative going on that we need to pursue these items. And so we have sort of sub-teams inside of DevTools that care about these particular initiatives, and we pour a lot of energy in understanding how these features work, how the implementation works, and we take care of the necessary plumbing in the backend as well. So example here would be trust tokens, which is ongoing for quite a while already, and we are actively talking to the respective team to figure out what to do here. And then, of course, this is sort of like a scale of different levels of engagement. So, for example, for BF cache, we talked to the implementing team in Tokyo about how to expose whether a web page can be BF cached, and if not, why not. And so we had a couple of meetings back and forth to discuss the technical side of things. gave a couple tips, but ultimately the expectation is that the feature teams themselves would do the necessary plumbing in the back end, and we would help them with front end. And often enough, there is enough curiosity and among the feature team to also look at how to do things in the front end. A third way is to have internships for these tooling support areas. So, for example, the web authentication panel that we recently added came out as a result of an internship, a very successful one at that.
How do we think about the sort of maintenance of this DevTools support? I mean, it's very tempting as a feature team to say, well, we'll get an intern or a temp or a vendor to implement DevTools support for our feature, and then the consequence of that ends up being that those code reviews go between the intern or whatever and the DevTools team, and then the DevTools team ends up being the only people with the expertise to maintain it. And do you feel like we're just sort of like dumping maintenance work onto you, or does that feel like the right approach to maintenance?
So I think the problem here is mostly we are fairly confident about maintaining the front end, but at the back end, often enough, we are not the experts here, and it becomes increasingly harder to sort of also maintain the back end. We encourage people to write test cases for the back end. We call them inspector tests, which sort of mock out the part of a CDP to talk to the backend. My experience so far is that the backend doesn't change too much over time, so that maintenance cost is not too high. But for the front end, we are fine with maintaining them over time ourselves, especially because there are certain nuances in the front end where the feature teams are not equipped to deal with. Stuff like adding accessibility support to the front end so that you can navigate it with the keyboard. I see Megan also posted a question. Do any platform teams feel a gap in tooling that those of us working on DevTools could help with? We'd love to understand those gaps so we can align the Microsoft priorities on platform needs. Yeah, indeed. I guess the entire presentation is sort of a call for action for platform teams that if you feel that your feature could use more tooling support, reach out to us. Like I said, Microsoft folks are also active on the mailing list. And if there is anything that makes sense for us to prioritize as well, we would love to set up collaborations here.
The mention of Microsoft sort of reminds me, to what extent when we add support to Chrome DevTools, does that benefit Microsoft Edge? Does Microsoft Edge basically just ship Chrome DevTools, or do they ship something different? Is there duplicated work that needs to be done there for something to be supported in both sides? Does work need to be done to turn off something in Edge DevTools that might not be supported in Edge but is in Chrome?
Yeah, I think I can answer this, but I think Megan or Gaurav, I see them here as well. They could also answer.
Yeah, the majority of everything that ships within the Edge DevTools is the same code bases, which is in the Chromium DevTools. And so a lot of the work that we have done has been in the Chromium base itself. I don't think that there is anything that is in Chromium that is specific to Edge. So any of these platform features, any of the needs that are there, I think both teams are contributing to, and looking at where we can add resourcing, where we can make sure that the web platform is covered for the needs of tooling. I think is a lot of a combined effort.
Yeah. So as a great example, I would like to list the CSS Grid tooling support that we worked together on. So over the course of several quarters, both the Chrome DevTools team and the Edge DevTools team collaborated on sort of bringing CSS Grid tooling to both Chrome DevTools and Edge DevTools, and that was really successful as well. But again, this is not really an example for sort of adding tooling support accompanying feature development. It came way later, and we are sort of being pressured into this because people have been saying, well, you can debug CSS script on Firefox DevTools way better than on Chrome. And so a year ago, around BlinkOn time, we arranged with Microsoft folks that we would work on this together. All right, I think we are over time already. So thank you for attending this. And, if you need one takeaway, think about us when you develop a new feature. All right, have a nice day, evening, morning, depending on our time zone. Bye.